Hey everyone, welcome to our first video on community interactions. In this video, we're going to talk about a couple of vocab words, so just make sure you're paying attention for each of those words and understanding what they mean. The first one is habitat, and this may be familiar to you, but it's just the place where animals or other organisms live. There are many different types of habitats you can see in these pictures here. And in each of the different habitats, there are different organisms. But for example, the parrots you see here, they live in the tropical rainforest habitat, and camels would live in the desert habitat, and penguins would live in the Arctic habitat. So there are different habitats, and you can see that those are the different places where organisms live. A niche is specifically the role and position a species has in its environment. It's basically how that organism stays alive, how it gets its food and shelter, how it survives, and how it can reproduce. But if you look at these different birds, they are all birds, but they all have different niches, meaning they have different ways of getting food, which helps them survive and reproduce. So you can see that based on their different beaks, they would have different roles or different niches in terms of what they're going to eat, even if they lived in the same place. The next thing to talk about is biotic versus abiotic factors. So there's many different things that can influence an organism and how that organism survives and reproduces. And some of those things are biotic, which means they're living things. Those are things like symbiotic relationships, which we're going to talk about, competition with other organisms, and predation, whether it's the predator or the prey. But that interaction with another living organism influences how one organism can survive. There are also abiotic, which is physical or non-living factors that can influence an organism. Those are things that include temperature, precipitation, humidity, wind, nutrients, and minerals that are available, soil, and sunlight. The other one here that I hadn't mentioned yet is water. And for many organisms, especially in the freshwater or marine biomes, that water is going to play a huge role in their survival. Even for you as a human, you will have biotic influences on your life. So things like other living organisms that you're interacting with, think about bacteria that are in your body that you're interacting with. Think about pets and things like that in your life that you're interacting with, and organisms that you might eat, plants or animals. Those are biotic factors in your life. And abiotic factors in your life are things like bad weather that can influence you, water availability, sunlight, soil that's around you for growing plants, the air that you breathe, the nutrients you take in, all of those things that are not living but impact your life are abiotic factors. Two abiotic factors are weather and climate, and people often mix up these ideas of weather and climate. You might remember talking about it in earth science, but weather is a day to day condition. It changes by the hour and by the day, and it's basically what the condition of the atmosphere is at one particular moment and place in time. There's all different types of weather, which you're familiar with. Climate is a year after year long term condition or temperature and amount of precipitation in a certain region. So, different regions of our planet have different climates. And so, those typically stay pretty stable and normal for years and years and years. But as we'll talk about towards the end of the school year, there are some global climate changes occurring, and we'll investigate that a little bit more later. Other things to think about, and what we're going to focus on are the biotic factors, the living things that impact other organisms. But when we're talking about the biotic factors, our big key word here on this slide is symbiosis. It's basically a relationship in which two species are living very closely together. And that can be a beneficial relationship or a harmful relationship. But if it's a relationship in which two species live closely together for a period of time, it's symbiosis. There are three main types of symbiosis. One is called mutualism. That's where both organisms benefit from the relationship. Commensalism is where one member of the relationship benefits and the other is kind of neutral, neither helped nor harmed. And parasitism is where one organism lives in or on another organism, a host, and actually harms it. So in mutualism, it's both our positive relationship. In commensalism, one is positive and one is kind of neutral. And in parasitism, for it's beneficial, it's positive for one organism, but it is very negative for the other organism, which is called a host. There are other relationships that are not where species live closely together for a period of time, so they're not symbiotic relationships. Let's talk about those two. One of them is competition. So, in competition, organisms aren't really living with one another or like on one another for a period of time, but both organisms are actually competing with each other, so they do interact. In competition, both organisms are harmed. There's a negative impact on both of them because of the fact that there's a limited supply of some resource that those organisms need. So, whether that's a mate, whether that's food, water, some other resource, there's a limited supply of it. And so the organisms that need that resource are both harmed because they now have to compete in order to get that resource. The last relationship we'll talk about is predation. That's an interaction in which one organism captures and feeds on another organism. So basically, one organism hunts down and eats another organism. Um, there are a lot of trends in animal populations due to the predator prey relationship. That's predation. Let's take a little more in depth look at that. Here you can see predator-prey interaction. Basically, key idea here is that the number of predators that are there in a certain area affects the number of prey that are there and vice versa. So if you look at this graph here, this is kind of an interesting predator-prey relationship, but if we're talking about this, we're saying that the tree is going to be eaten, and the one eating the tree is this insect. And so what you can see is that when there's an increase in the number of prey or an increase in the number of trees, a little while later there's going to be an increase in the number of insects. And if the number of trees decreases, then following after that, the number of insects will decrease. Then, when the number of trees goes back up, you can see that the number of insects goes back up. So there's a direct relationship between the number of trees here and the number of insects. If we're talking about other animals, more of a classical predator-prey relationship where it's both animals, you can see here that when there is an increase in hares or rabbits, then later on there will be an increase in lynx. So there has to be an increase in hares, which is the prey, before there can be an increase in lynx, which is the predators. And when the number of hares goes down, soon after that, the number of lynx will go down, and they will kind of follow a cycle like that that tends to happen for predator prey relationships over long periods of time. Is that the number of prey will increase, then predators. The number of prey will decrease, then the number of predators decreases because there aren't enough prey animals to hunt. Then the number of prey will increase because there are fewer predators. And then the number of predators will increase because there's more food for them to eat. And then it goes in a cycle of up and down, up and down, up and down over time, over a long period of time. Thank you so much for listening.